This is Rocky Snyder. At the tone, leave your name and message and I'll get back to you.
Hey Dad, I was riding my bike down this alley today, and I saw this guy with a really weird walk coming toward me. I think you'd call him an alligator.
Well, welcome to the fourth season of the Rock Fit Files. I'm Rocky Snyder, and I thought a neat idea would be to dedicate this entire season to an educational approach, philosophy, coursework, however you call it. What we call it is anatomy in motion. And I've started studying it back in 2014 with two amazing teachers, Gary Ward, who is the creator and founder of the course work itself, and his protege, Chris Shratharan. And I'm going to have on this week Gary Ward, and then the following episode next week is going to be Chris. And from that point on, every week we'll be inviting a colleague who has been through the coursework, who has integrated all of that knowledge and experience into their professional world and get a better understanding of how it is that we take this information and make what we do more effective, more powerful, and more long-lasting. So, Gary, welcome to the Rock Fit Files.
Thank you so much, Rocky, for what you are about to do in what is now season 4. Amazing. Thank you.
Yes, I don't know if it was very popular over in the UK, but James Garner in the late 70s had the Rockford Files. It was just a great PI show, lost on you, but there you have it. That's where the name comes from. But just a brief background, brief background. I got to know Gary. It was really serendipitous because I was just kind of scrolling through some Facebook posts back in 2013. I came upon this excerpt from his recently released book at that time called What the Foot, and it was remarkable. It was basically giving me the information that I was yearning for, all about gait mechanics, the role that the foot plays, and the chain reaction that occurs up through the body. And not only that, but how the conventional way of moving the body or exercising was quite different than really what he was trying to invoke or suggest. And it was along the same path that I was kind of pursuing at the time too. So I sent away from his book, and he so kindly wrote a little handwritten insert in there saying, if you like what you see and read, then why not join me for a workshop? And it just so happened that only a few months later that Gary was coming to the US for the very first time and teaching a course just north of San Francisco, only an hour or so north of where I live. So it just fell into my lap, and I'm so glad it did, because we've been friends ever since then, and student teacher all the while. Honestly, one of my most endearing mentors of my life with the professional knowledge that you've imparted. So yeah, I just can't say enough great things. And honestly, part of the subtitle of What the Foot is, it's a game-changing philosophy, and you couldn't have nailed it any better than that, because it really changed my career and created a much more comprehensive understanding of the human form and motion. So I want to get right into it. The whole project that you started back in 2010 with the creation of the flow motion model, was that basically how it began, right around then?
Probably more. No, it was more like 2006, 2007. Yeah.
And so just to bring people up to speed, when we say the flow motion model, we are talking about Gary creating this chart, this incredible spreadsheet that shows the different phases of the overall gait cycle. And there's numerous phases, but there's specific major phases, we'll call, or primary phases that occur when you take a step to the very next time that same leg takes a step. It occurs in less than a second. But in that time, all the joints of your body, all the muscle tissue that connects to those bones that create the joints, have to go through three-dimensional movement from one end of the spectrum to the other. And what he did, quite remarkably, was he dedicated himself to understanding what every single joint in the body does through three-dimensional space through the entire gait cycle. And that is what we call the flow motion model. It is a model from which we compare people and how they move and find out what's missing in that model. So you started that in 2006. Just give us just a brief kind of overview as to when you started. Did you know what you were getting yourself into?
Absolutely no idea. Absolutely not. It's such a long time ago that the lines are definitely blurred. But there was a school of thought at the time, and over in England we used to have Fit Pro conventions, and a chap called Gary Gray used to come along. And you'll all know Gary Gray, godfather of function. And there was this just general idea of a leg forward and a leg back. And I really didn't know what it was about, what it was doing. And I remember I turned up on a course, or it was an exam actually, and came all the way down to London from my home up in Nottinghamshire in England. And one of the guys on this course just kept kind of lunging forward and doing a three-dimensional, psoas stretch really, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So I just tried it, and then things felt quite good. So I went home and I thought, what the hell was that guy doing? And so I started looking at the body position. I was very, 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 very anatomically interested, not unsurprisingly, but in everything from what it took to have a perfect neutral spine, what happened when you breathe, breathing mechanics, how it was at the time was all about core stability and how to impart that on somebody with back pain. And so I was very diligent, very careful, very caring, very conscious of body position, movement, holding things still, making things move, getting everything right, just really anal about the whole thing. But always struggled with helping people, which was actually what people were coming to me for under the label of personal trainer at the time. So that was a challenge because they come for help, and it was hard. So what you do as a young personal trainer, as you know, is you go and find a course that will help you, and they weren't coming along. So this kind of interventions bumped into me. And spent a good few months looking at things. And there was a moment where there was a kind of disagreement between something that I was seeing and something that somebody else was seeing. But I discovered that what somebody else was seeing was what somebody else had told them. So they weren't seeing what I was seeing because they were seeing what they'd been told. And this was a huge moment for me when I realized that I actually, if I want to understand this properly, going to have to work it out myself, because I can't rely on people seeing things that they thought they had been told that guy who had told them thought was correct. So that was me. I need to work this out on my own, and I just started. And to fill the gap from the Gary Gray mention was all there was talk of a leg forward and a leg back, and I was desperate to know how the leg got from being at the front to being at the back and becoming the front leg again, because it's a cycle. It is the Gait cycle. So you already mentioned what we're really interested in is what's missing, and I was just intrigued by what was missing. So the world of Gait has been around for a long, long time. The model of Gait has been around for a long, long time. But working with people in the Gait cycle, upright, in motion and in the closed chain, that was a very new thing. That wasn't something that was happening. We had a lot of Paul Check work at the time, who I was a huge fan, I still am a huge fan of any of Paul's work. And that was very much, once you'd isolated and stabilized your core, then you would move into an integrating pattern. And pretty much soon you'd be looking at working with 3 planes of motion in a lunge format with a medicine ball, but very controlled, very stable. And it was the stable bit that just kept nagging me, because in my head, movement isn't stable. And one day, in the pursuit of all of this, if anyone's listened to other podcasts, they'll know that I started life as a ski boot fitter, and I bumped into another ski boot fitter who actually owned a shop, a shoe fitting shop and a ski boot fitting shop in London called Profeet, and his name was Hamish Wolfenden, and he introduced me to the force plate, the force platform where we can see pressures on people's feet, and we got on like a house on fire. And it was looking at force plates that helped me to suddenly see that when somebody is standing still, they are perpetually still in motion on the inside, and they're calm and they're minding their own business, and they're stood on a force plate and they're not moving to their own mind, but the machine is seeing movement everywhere. And that was it for me. That was, we are never stable, ever stable. And so why would we spend time trying to be that thing that we're not? And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that if you actually look at somebody's skeletal structure, the chance of it being neutral, i.e. evenly weight distributed between the left foot and the right foot, evenly distributed between your toes and 4 feet and your heel, pelvis in the right position, spine upright, nobody's like that. And so all of the stability was just locking us into these disorganized postures. And the force plate just showed us all of that. And for me, that was a huge treat. And to be able to watch them walk. And when you watch them walk over a force plate, there's this little white line that runs from heel to toe. And it's called the center of pressure curve. And that center of pressure curve, as Hamish pointed out to me, was indicative of moments in time in the Gait cycle. And he had 4 moments in time. And he likened them to then he gave them the names according to a car. And so he had, I think it was braking, then suspension, and then shift, like the gear shift, and then propulsion. And so you'll know that I kept a few of the words. And so we had these 4 phases, and effectively, there was braking was when you put your heel on the ground, initial contact. So a normal Gait cycle has a heel strike. The second part of a normal perceived Gait cycle is when the foot goes flat. So they call it foot flat. And that was where Hamish called it suspension. And so we took suspension because that's where the body absorbs most of the shock. So in order to do that and experience that moment well, your foot needs to be able to adapt in a mobile way to the ground. And then you'll have ankle flexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, and you'll watch the whole skeleton just concertina into this shock absorbing posture. And then interesting, which we can come to later, that has this huge impact on the muscles. Suddenly, the vast majority of muscles in the body in that moment lengthen, they gain length. And then the response to that length is a contraction, which started to form the laws that I was seeing. So these laws, these muscles contract and they would lift the body up tall, and the weight would come from the left foot and move into the right foot, which is what he called the shift. You can see it on the pressure curve. And then the toe off would be propelling forward. So Hamish unfortunately passed away a good number of years ago now, and kind of left me with all these drawings of a 4-phase model that was born out of looking at the foot plates. So I kept with the foot force plates, and I kept with the models. And it was once teaching, actually, when Hamish was still alive, I was teaching live in the classroom, and I was showing them how the body and the structure will go from this heel strike moment into that suspension moment where we absorb all the shock. And I was about to describe how they enter into shift, and all of a sudden I went, oh, there's something else just happened here. The foot now has an opportunity to start supinating from its pronated position. We later called that resupination in the book. And while the tripod is on the ground, the foot is supinating and the body is standing up tall. And I called it the transition from suspension into shift. You're transitioning. And transition is where everything changes, which is where all of those muscles that we described in suspension a minute ago, all long, they all get to go short. And any bone that's traveling in this direction gets to travel in the opposite direction. So it's a moment where everything changed in the Gait cycle. So that was like a huge, like, eureka moment for me. And of course, in all of this, we're starting to build that idea from how my leg got in front of me to how my leg got behind me. And then when it took off the ground again, it rolled forward into this leg swing. So long story short, I suppose we've been teaching, as you know, the 5 phases. So we changed the names to be strike, where you heel strike, initial contact with the calcaneus on the ground. Suspension phase, which is the shock absorbing phase already mentioned. Transition phase, which is the one that I uncovered, where everything changes in the structure, and the body is, it's almost like a rest point for the muscles, and an opportunity to experience a really neutral position in your body. And then a shift phase, which is where you shift your weight from your left foot to your right foot, and then propelling, so the actual moment just before toe off, where the two metatarsals are still on the ground. And then we come into early swing, and then we come into late swing before we come back to strike. And then, interestingly, as time builds, we have the question is what's happening in between each one of those moments. And ultimately, there's 12 phases that have been mapped and documented to complete this model. And it took 11 years to get from one to the last one.
And well, and it takes many years to really digest all the information that you just put forth in the last 5 minutes. I try to myself kind of share that with people from time to time, whether it's on other podcasts that will have me, and it's just a lot of information to try and disseminate to the listening audience. So don't feel, for those listening, don't feel like you shouldn't be overwhelmed, because you should. It's a tremendous amount. What I heard you say, two things that are remarkable, is one, that early on, you were brave enough to question the conventional thought that was out there at the time, that were in publications, textbooks, and the like, and that professors, teachers, whatnot, were teaching this information, but it was incomplete or erroneous, wrong, however you'd like to say it, and that it was only because that information had been carried over from one generation to the next without truly considering or observing truly how the body moves. And the other part, aside, and you continue to do that actually, by going along with Hamish and then discovering the phase of transition and actually going, oh, wait a minute, there's more than just what I have been taught or led to understand. So two major landmark moments in going, okay, I'm going to actually experience it in my body or observe it somewhere else. And does that correspond to what I've been taught? And some of those times, that there you go, those epiphanies.
In each case, it wasn't complete, and there was an insufficiency to all of that information. It wasn't complete, it wasn't rounded off, and it wasn't a full stop at the end. And as you know, even when we talk about working with clients, we look for what's missing. We don't look for what they've got and try to make it better. We look for what they haven't got. We look for what they need. We look for what's missing. So until we can put a full stop at the end of that client's life cycle with you, you continually keep going. And what's missing, I think there's just been a huge part of my, I probably have to say, life, more than just anatomy. It's always been about filling a void. If I could feel a void, I would want to fill it. I would move into it and explore it so that I can understand it rather than hide away from it. And I think that's been a huge part of my own journey. And so still to this day, bold statement, but the flow motion model is known by very few people comparative to the amount of people in our industry. And still the vast majority of information that is beyond the anatomy and motion conversation is still insufficient. And I see it every single day. The people touting their messages believe they're accurate, and for the most part they are, but there's just more to it. There's more to see, and it would be lovely to be able to lift the veil almost for as many people as possible, so they get to see what I believe is actually born as the truth of human movement. And the truth comes from getting a sense of completeness from the work, the effectiveness of the work, obviously, but all the way down, Rocky, all the way down to the fact that we can safely say that all of the movement that we describe in the human body is not an opinion. It's actually formed from the shape of the bones themselves. And that's just such a wonderful thing, is to be able to say, I'm not saying this because I think it. I'm saying it because it's the only thing that can possibly happen. And when you bump into moments of investigation where you can see that thanks to the shape of the bones, this movement has to happen, And then this is a movement that people are condemning, or people are saying is not useful, or people have described as evil, or something that we should cut out and eliminate, you start to go, hang on, because there is not a single movement that our body is not set up to be able to do. It has a timing for it. It has a moment for it. It has a reason for it. And for us to take that away from the human in our therapeutic processes is denying them the freedom that their bones have been craving for their whole life. That they've been making these bones since they were born, right?
I have a
And we
sense
need
that
to be able to-
you're alluding to a foot that whose arches are going too far, quote unquote, to the ground, overly pronating, or a knee that's traveling valgus as it flexes, or
stuff that makes
even
you go, oh,
scoliotic shift. You know,
yeah.
all these things, right? These are things that are actually part of our human nature of movement, and that should be experienced. The
But
only
the
trouble is
concept,
that some people get fixated in them and either don't know how to drop in and get out,
yeah.
or whatever the case may be. And so we say, well, you shouldn't be doing that. That's bad. That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to build, to add on to that, I think one of the most fascinating things for me was, let's say there are various conditions, like you just said, scoliosis. There are forefoot varus. There are compressed sacroiliac joints. There are think of something else. Compressed suboccipitals, anything like this, and every single one of those things that I just said shows up in the gait cycle. You have to have it. You cannot complete an efficient flowing gait cycle if you do not allow your forefoot to go varus, if you do not compress a suboccipital, if you do not compress a hip and a sacroiliac joint, if you do not allow a scoliotic moment in the spine. The problem is, and the problem that we always bump into, is when people are stuck in those for a long time. And so then it's all about timing. If you get the timing of these movements right, and as you just mentioned, you get in and you get out, you set people free. When you get stuck in these things and you can't get out of them, you reduce the flow, you reduce the inefficiency, and you put tension into the muscle system and compression into the joints. And then we have people recording problems. Not everybody. Some people have got very distorted structures and never have any pain, and good luck to them. But what does that mean for their future? And can we, in terms of athletes, could we use what we know to help people reorganize their postures to be more efficient? And in people with pain, can we reorganize their postures to be more comfortable? But yeah, for me, the model has thrown up so many things that they really question a lot of the evidence that is out there. There are certain things that we can disprove, I think, from the model, which is a long-term kind of project. It's just been utterly fascinating.
I gotta say, the epiphany, that light bulb moment that occurred those many years back when I first started reading your book, was what you just described in regards to all of these postural distortions, for lack of a better word, because it's not really distorting. It's a postural motion that we're able to achieve. But I'm seeing people and trying to help realign their posture with exercise leading up to that point. And I'm seeing all of these variations to alignment. And when I read that every single one of those distortions will have a place somewhere in the gait cycle, that was the moment that I had found. I'm going, oh my gosh, that's honestly the most brilliant thing I had heard in my entire life at that point. Going, that was incredible. It gave me an understanding so much more, and it gave me the appetite to learn all about the gait cycle. If this is going to truly occur, I need to know when this is occurring, because if I could place a person in that position and guide them through those movements, it would be so much better than laying them on their back and activating this muscle or that muscle, which leads us to the next thing that I'm thinking of. Is when you were exploring these movements, you were not exploring what each muscle does, even though what brought you to that was watching somebody do a 3-dimensional psoas stretch. Initially it was all about the muscle, but very quickly you converted that mindset into what are the bones doing, which
Mm.
is in itself not to make your head swell any further than, you got double doors in your home, I hope, because then you'll never be able to leave after this. But I'm just amazed that to consider the bones moving, it seems so, of course, when you consider it, it seems so obvious. But if I just watch one joint move, then I get a better sense of what all the surrounding tissue has to do to accommodate that movement. And here we are still in the old-fashioned modality, whether it's movement therapy or manual therapy, physical therapy, or even to some degree chiropractic care, and all the rest of them. We're looking at individual muscles or small groups of muscles, and we're targeting them as this is the issue or this is the problem, when in fact it's not really the most effective way of getting change to occur. If we can focus on the skeletal system, as we say in America, yes, the skeletal, you could say, whatever you want to do, it's so much more, I don't want to use the word powerful, but much more all-encompassing. How about that?
Yeah.
So when you started looking at the bones, did you understand that did you make that shift over? Like when you stopped looking at the muscles and started looking at the bones?
Everyone is obsessed with muscles. We're still obsessed with muscles. Everyone's obsessed with muscles. If you did weight training as a young adult, you're obsessed with muscles. And we all learn what a muscle does. It moves a bone. But when you, again, just back to the gait cycle, when you start looking, there's this idea, before I do that, but there's this idea that a muscle we will shorten it in order to make it effective. And when looking at the gait cycle, as you're observing the movement of these bones, the first thing that I worked out about the muscle before I really got obsessed with the bones is that the muscles are contracting from their most lengthened position. Always. There's never a moment where a muscle in the gait cycle contracts from neutral to short, ever. So the first shocking thing was that, you don't use a psoas to bring your knee up and bring your leg forward. You use your psoas to bring your leg forward from its most lengthened position, which is when it's obviously, the hip is obviously an extension, and there's 3 dimensions to that. So in order to bring my leg forward, I have to get length into it first. Same with the glutes. In order to make the glute active, the glute will contract when it is in its most lengthened position. Abs, when they're in their most lengthened position. Rhomboids, when they're in their most lengthened position. And you start to realize that, that the posture that people are in, or the limitations that they're having, are down to them not actually being able to get their skeleton into that position in order to give that muscle an option to contract from a lengthened position. So you suddenly are like, wow, I need to look at the bones. I needed to see what the bones were doing in order to see if I could then stimulate that tissue to wake up. And the reason we use the word wake up is because notoriously people would say muscles are sleepy, dormant, that kind of language. But you could switch a muscle on. You could get a muscle to be more effective, not by poking it or teaching it to contract, but by lengthening it. And I don't mean in a stretch way. So stretching didn't really work. And the reason stretching doesn't work is because you don't give a chance for the bones to move in a way that allows the muscle to contract. And I think if you're looking at everything, you described it actually wonderfully, but the footstep is 0.6 to 0.8 seconds long. In that window of 0.6 to 0.8 seconds, every single bone in the human body goes to both ends of its direction in all 3 planes: flex and extend, adduct and abduct, internally and externally rotate. Foot pronates and supinates. Some things, knees flex twice in the cycle. All of this stuff is happening inside 0.6 to 0.8 seconds. And all the muscles that are attached to that, in order for that to be effective, must lengthen and shorten in the same time window, every muscle in all 3 dimensions. That's like a huge amount of stuff going on. So I always laugh when people say I've come to watch people, in Gait, and I always say good luck with that one. Because, unless you're like Rain Man or something. And so we have to slow it down, and that's part of the pun in flow motion is slow motion, to look at that. But getting these muscles then, the awareness was that if we can actually get the bones to move in the way they're intended to, then all of the muscles have to follow suit. Like you said, there are 13 muscles attaching to a knee. So if you can teach that knee to flex and extend in the appropriate way with a foot pronating and supinating, all of those muscles would be involved rather than working on one. And I think as I got older with the work, we see people working on individual muscles, but not actually affecting the joint integrity and the joint's potential to move. And the reason you can work on one muscle and not affect the joint is because that joint is not communicated to by the muscle. It's communicating to other joints above and below. So say the hip for the knee and the foot for the knee. And actually it's the joints as a collective unit that are the ones communicating to the muscle. And that led to the rule joints act and muscles react. And closely coupled with the first rule, which was the euphoric moment of wow, muscles contract from a lengthened position in movement always, which you can watch just watching a leopard run in slow motion on YouTube. You can see that, or sprinters. And the first rule was that muscles lengthen before they contract. And so bringing muscles lengthen before they contract, not the other way around, and joints act, muscles react, not the other way around, into the equation, we suddenly had a new side of the coin that needed to be considered. And that's not to say that the other side is incorrect, because of course I can contract a muscle and move a joint. Of course I can shorten a muscle before I lengthen it. And we'll do that for various activities, but gross, global, integrated, closed chain movement, you'll never see it happen.
And something that we had a conversation not too long ago, I believe, or maybe I was just listening to one of the educational platforms, I don't recall which, but we're talking about, because I just listen to all the time, is that every sport and athletic pursuit and competition is really dictated by the human form, which sounds obvious, but when you think about it, there's only so many ways in which we can create variations of movement. And we have to stay connected. It's not like our appendages are detachable necessarily to create a completely new kind of movement. And therefore, every single pursuit of humankind is really predicated on how we fundamentally move, which of course is the Gait cycle, which we've been doing for, if we just think of modern humans, for 60,000 years. But beyond that, to Australopithecus, we're talking maybe 2-point-something million years of evolution and adaptation. So it's something that has been so hardwired into our system that it only makes sense when we think about improving performance, let's say, in the athletic field, that we should be comparing all movements at least back to the grandparents of Gait. And it's fascinating that I keep having talks with people in the fitness industry that, as well, for one, as soon as I bring up Gait, it's overwhelming. They don't want to learn it because there's so much to it, which is really quite a disservice to themselves. And so they are limited in their approach without having that knowledge at their disposal. But it's really interesting to see the types of approaches that are out there that are dictating or creating programs based on laying on your back and lifting your leg, or balancing on a 2x4, or whatever the case may be, things that we don't commonly do. It just makes sense that whether you're a movement therapist, a manual therapist, chiropractor, or whatnot, it would be a great idea to understand the human relationship of joint action. And so as we go deeper into understanding the anatomy of movement, or anatomy and motion, and that flow motion model, you encouraged, I know Laura Richards, I'll mention Laura right here because she's my hero or heroine. She was the first to accomplish the 100-day challenge, which is filling out the spreadsheet of the flow motion model, which contains 400 plus boxes every day on a day-to-day basis for 100 days. And she was the one that broke the mold there, and I followed her footsteps with it. And as I did that, I just saw so many other underlying relationships that I hadn't even considered or been aware of. But it's so much more than just simply watching joints move. It's understanding that there's certain segments of the body that are identical in their movement in every motion or every phase in the gait cycle. So when you started to find those relationships out, that must have been like a kid in a candy store. I mean, you must have been, but you had very few people to yell from the rooftops and shout Eureka, right? So it's got to be frustrating at the same time. It was just mind blowing. Can you recall a few times like that?
Oh, countless. I almost have to correct you a little bit. What the as I remember teaching, you mentioned already that Chris and I have been teaching you at every moment. But before, there was a time before Chris where he came on a course as a student, and then I invited him to come and sit on a few courses. And after a few, he started hearing things differently, like you say. So there's a surface level of what the model is. And then the more you look at it, like anything, the more clarity you get, the more depth there is, the more insight there is, the more relationships you see, the more you can make this, see how this communicates with that. He used to come up to me on a break, and he'd go, have you noticed this? Have you noticed that? And some of those moments I was like, oh, wow, I hadn't actually seen that myself. So I was, there was a place when Chris joined in and started to put his input in, that it escalated again in our heads and in terms of clarity. And actually the evolution of that has gone from being a very exercise-based movement thing, which is what I was doing in the early days, to evolving into a very therapeutic model as a result of a lot of the insight that he brought to the table as well, which we would obviously then put our heads together, and then I would typically go and sit down and map out the next version of whatever that little nugget of information unfolded. But so there were so many exciting moments. We have a
Can you give a couple of examples, just a couple examples that either he was blown away, you were blown away, or collectively?
My favorite one is when we laid out the gait phase on post-it notes, little yellow post-it notes on the floor, and we were looking at how they communicate, and as we were laying them out on the floor, this is while teaching a course, and set everybody out on a little task, and we were just sticking these down, and it became clear that there were relationships not just from one phase to the next, but in between the other phases, and I could see it, but I couldn't really see it, if you like. But I took it home and sat up till, there were several occasions where I just sat up until 2 or 3 in the morning, just mapping stuff out. You just couldn't put it down. And then, and you'll know we have a thing called the ghost phase, which we don't talk about too often, but it just excites me that this ghost phase is you have the phase you have the phase that you're interested in, and you know that is going to impact on the phase that happens next. So anything, if you've got a phase a moment in time when you're on your foot and there's a moment to follow, how well you do the preceding moment is going to dictate how well you do the next one. And then you've got this other leg, so your right leg, how well you perform that phase on the right leg is going to mean that you can perform the phase on the left leg better. And then the left leg is affected by the one behind it. And so all of a sudden we were able to see how this moment on my left leg could actually be holding back this moment in future time on my right leg, which means that's why this person's neck hurts. and it was like, oh my God. And over time you learn to navigate the system, and it's very exciting, and people would always wanted to know, what the advanced stuff is, what that level of detail in the work is. And we used to we've always had to, unfortunately, draw a line, which is you'll be ready when you're ready. But as you already said, it takes so long to master, understand, appreciate, not just to be able to write the model out 100 times, but to know how to use it at each moment with anybody, to be able to navigate their system, etc. It's a huge model, and we're embarking on delivering this online now because we're in COVID-19 times. And the sad thing for me delivering it online is and I'm looking forward to building more. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a huge necessity to do it. But there is this, if I watch the program online, and then in order to appreciate what I'm learning, I might go and learn something else somewhere else from someone else and start to bump into conflicting information, because the information from the model does not match what anybody else is talking about outside of this work. And so I see conflict. I see people picking it up, putting it down, working on other elements, maybe easier, maybe more accessible. But I want people to know that the value, if you spend your time working hard inside this model and getting the basics right first, there's a huge opportunity for you in the work that you're really passionate about.
And all fairness, though, everything you say, spot on in terms of the complexity and the amount of time it takes to truly get a deeper sense of comprehension and the ability to work with such a complex model. However, it doesn't mean that you can't start, and just getting a little bit of that information and applying it to your work can be game changing. And then as time goes by, you get more tools, more understanding, a greater degree of experience working with people with this model, and the leaps of efficacy become beyond linear, almost to the point of exponential. So it doesn't require to wait and study for years and years before applying it. You just apply it as soon as you gain a base understanding. And because ultimately, here's one of those things. I love to relay the story of my son as he pursues his black belt in karate. His sensei had been studying karate for 60 plus years. And at one point in time, he obviously became a black belt, but over the course of years after attaining that, the belt started wearing over and wearing out until the point where there was no more black on the belt and it was just this white belt. And I thought, what a beautiful analogy that the beginner becomes the master, and in the end it just all reverts back to what he learned at the beginning, and he's once again a white belt. And with the pursuit of learning, knowledge, and so on, what has come to me in the last, I don't know, year or two was that we really only have two options, don't we? When it comes to movement, we're either landing on the planet or we're leaving the planet. And if we can just boil those two components down, what do we do when the body pronates and lands and absorbs impact? And what does it do when it does the opposite and pushes us away? I mean, once we get that understanding, that's a gold mine in itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it took years to get to, right?
Yeah,
it took years to get to.
I wanted to say earlier, it is complex, it is hard work, but it's also ridiculously simple work. And it's how do you have that? And that's because it is all ends of the spectrum. And I think you've just put that lovely. For the majority of people who have problems in their body, if you map their body out, and what we mean by that is work out how their pelvis rests in space, how their rib cage and spine rests in space, how their skull rests in space, shoulder girdle, and what their feet look like on the ground and where their foot pressures are. If you map that into the Gait model, you will find that your client either struggles to get left leg forward or right leg forward. And that's it. That could be their neck discomfort, that could be their shoulder, that could be, and being able to just give them that experience, not just put your right leg forward, do a right leg lunge, but when you put your right leg forward, the foot needs to pronate. In order to pronate, there's 26 bones that need to go into these positions in 3 dimensions. We need to flex your ankle, flex your knee. There's a rotation in the knee that we need to pay attention to that affects the pelvis, blah, 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 blah. There's muscles lengthening, the whole body, that is how particular we are. And it's not just about, a right foot forward, but ultimately that is going to sort the vast majority of people out.
Honestly, I did the exact same thing. That happened this morning with me. I had an appointment with a gentleman who came in to see me. He had tried numerous other approaches, and he was complaining of left groin pain. He wakes up with it. He goes to bed with it. It's there constantly. And his left Achilles tendon had been bothering him. And not to give too great of a history, but he had surgery on both feet. years after one another. He had dislocated his shoulder and so on, and his body subconsciously created a strategy to get around these issues and experiences in life to put him in a position where he now was encountering these symptoms. And of course, traditionally you would go see somebody and they would look where the symptoms are and not at the whole body. Well, it just came down to, well, putting him on the force plate, it shows that he's really over his right leg and he doesn't experience much on his left leg. And what if we were to just have his left leg forward? And then what happens, just like you say, can the foot behave in such a way? Well, we'll put maybe a wedge or two to see if it'll behave a little bit better and get those bones moving in just the right way. And is the ankle moving now? Is the knee moving now? But I kid you not, as soon as he put his left leg forward and began loading onto that leg by bending into the knee and bringing his weight onto that left foot, he stopped dead in his tracks. And he just stared down at me and our masked faces. And I said, is there something wrong? Does that hurt? He said, no, I don't feel it. And it was the first time he had found a position where he did not experience pain. He forgot all about his Achilles. He was focused on his hip. And so we said, okay, well, if loading onto your left leg gives you good relief, or you're starting to experience something that you haven't been, what would it be like in the next step, literally, so to speak, the next phase of this, which would be that transition you spoke of earlier? Can I get him to truly get into his left leg and bring weight onto it? And he walked around after that, and he was just said, I've gone from a 10, I think I might be at a 1. I don't want to say 0 because I'm afraid to say 0, but I'm just going to say 1. And he walked away a completely different person, all because he learned how to get his left leg forward.
Yeah, something that he will not have chosen to do consciously or unconsciously due to limitations in his body, due to his history, due to his habitual movement for a long, long time. And you're the first person to give him that opportunity. And the brain and the body love that freedom so much, they just drink it like a parched man.
I love it. I love it. It was just something that was, like you say, there's so much complexity to it, but ultimately it was, could he just bring his left leg forward? And unfortunately, this is not something that is studied in medical school. In fact, they spend a total of 2 weeks studying biomechanics out of the entire span of years becoming a doctor. We won't even mention nutrition. I think that might be 2 hours of studied material there. But it's not something either. I mean, to some degree, it's opening up the doors in physical therapy, as I see it, physiotherapy, but with the help of fellows like Gary Gray and others, are starting to see more physical therapists in this region look at the body as an integrative unit as a whole, and not necessarily feel confined to just look at this one painful segment of the body and expect to just do some manual therapy, ice and stim, and send them on its way. There's still plenty of dinosaurs.
And the amount of people talking about feet and being upright and gait, like you said, is a big thing. And the concern is that it gets a bit faddy, and it's another gait person. But actually, it's where the detail is, and I think the model, what I'm looking forward to in the future is that people would actually be able to look at an actual model of gait, because the existing one is very two-dimensional, and I think, interestingly, if you try to match current scientific paradigms and put gait to scientific works, you don't actually get a flowing gait cycle. You have problems. So if you've got whereas when you actually, what I'm trying to say is, when the people that are being used for scientific evidence and data on force plates are not walking very well because they are not adhering to the model. And so the science doesn't spit out the model because we're monitoring people who don't walk very well. That makes sense.
Yes, and of course, and how they're monitoring and observing them half the time is on a treadmill, which is going to completely throw the mechanics off, because the world does not revolve around you like it does on a treadmill. So the way in which your body responds to that is going to be quite different in many respects. So now we're basing this information on incomplete or incorrect information, or the other people that are coming out as the gait guy experts or whomever they are, it's becoming much more fashionable to talk about the feet and gait. And so where are they getting their information but from the incomplete traditional knowledge that you earlier observed that, well, that's actually not really what's happening.
Yeah.
So
there's a long way to go.
There is, but at least we're taking the right steps forward. Here's more of those puns here. I don't mean to have it be that way, but talking about moving into the future, you've already discussed like doing courses online, which is very challenging. I know some other teachers of mine that have been very reluctant to do so because actually being present in the room is a major part of learning, and to be just having virtual communication, albeit with video, it is still lacking to some degree. But moving into the future, I guess we should also mention to those not familiar with anatomy and motion, you've got some really great educational videos for the general population to help encourage awareness of the body, and in so doing, a byproduct would be a reduction or elimination of chronic or acute pains that are created because of how somebody may create an improper strategy of moving, and then eventually it turns into pain. So you've got wake up the body and the feet, and what else would
wake your body up and wake your feet up? So also very, very good feedback from those. And they are all around the idea of taking ownership of your body, which is something we haven't actually mentioned, but recognizing that if you can begin to do gentle movement yourself that will help you access this gait cycle we've been talking about, you'll be able to reduce the tensions and compressions in your own system, have a more efficient way of moving, get more access to your right leg and left leg evenly, etc., etc. So you're actually able to do this on your own in your living room in front of a screen, guided by me in the Wake Your Body Up program. The Wake Your Body Up is looking at the pelvis upwards, and the Wake Your Feet Up is looking at the pelvis downwards. And instead of the usual strengthen your arches, scrunch towels, do tiptoes, lacrosse ball under the arch, instead of that's all the standard stuff, we're actually taking the opportunity to teach you how to use these wedges that you've talked about to interrupt movement, slow movement down, speed movement up, so that you get the appropriate movement in as many bones as you physically can in your feet, which is what wakes the muscles up and allows the legs to move differently, which will speak to the pelvis and on upwards into your spine. So it's been interesting because I've had people with back problems and say, I've been working through Wake Your Body Up, but it's not really that helpful. And we've switched them on to Wake the Feet Up, and they've had great results, and vice versa. People with feet problems, I'm saying this, you've done all of the stuff with the feet, your problem's not in your feet, unfortunately. Jump on to Wake Your Body Up, and they report back that was the thing that did the trick. So putting the two together is also a huge part of the process, and that's one of the reasons why we've kept them very inexpensive, hopefully, and highly accessible. So Wake Your Body Up and Wake Your Feet Up. Yeah, that's those
Fantastic.
two. And then obviously we've got the online education that we've just begun that you just mentioned, which, and this is a world exclusive on the RockFit podcast because nobody's been told this yet, but we have now got an exam process and CPD, global CPD points for the courses. So that's a huge win for us, hopefully.
Fantastic. So if you want more information, findingcenter.co.uk, and center is spelled the English way with the RE at the end of center. So findingcenter.co.uk, and you can get all information about the coursework, the Wake Your Body Up, Wake Your Feet Up, or is it Wake Up Your Body, Wake Up Your Feet? I can never get those around.
Wake Your Body Up.
We're going to wake it up no matter what. Well, Gary, this has been a great hour for me. I really appreciate you sharing some time with me. Like always, it just deepens my friendship and respect for you. And what I'd like to do, if you're okay with this, we haven't really spoken it, but I'll put you on the spot here then, is that I'd like to invite you back at the end of this season, kind of as the bookends between all of your students.
Oh, yeah.
And just kind of have like a finale of season 4 here, which will occur probably sometime in January.
And I'd equally be excited to hear what all of our fellow students have got to say, because the interesting part is they all come from different backgrounds and they all apply the model in their own way. And I think that's a very unique part of this model as well, is there's not one way to work with it, but there's a way that it can work with whatever modality you're coming from. So I'm really excited to hear from them and grateful for you putting this out there, because it's a wonderful step. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. All right. Well, we'll speak to you another time.
If you'd like to find out more information about the flow motion model, anatomy and motion courses, or Gary Ward himself, pick up a copy of his book, What the Foot, at findingcenter.co.uk. And while you're at it, pick up a copy of my book, Return to Center, where I take the flow motion model and apply it to strength training and conditioning. You can get a copy of that at rockysnyder.com. Thanks for listening.